So we've talked about then the cyclum idea, and there's these 4 seasons, roughly about 20 years each: spring, summer, autumn, winter, and then they cycle again every roughly 80 years. And these energies come online. Now let's talk about the actual generations. Those you said that there's. I mean, I know this too. I'm teeing you up so we can have this dialogue. We've talked about there's these 4 archetypical generations that cycle through. Let's talk about that next.
Okay. So right. So the saculum and the seasons are the context, and then the archetypal generations are the people who are born in each of these contexts. So the people who are born are the generation that is born in spring, in the time period of renewal and a high, are the what's called the prophet generation. And our version of the prophet generation are baby boomers. That's our prophets, right, that are alive right now. Prophet generations are generations who are, well, first of all, they're dominant. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there are more of them than other generations, although often that is the case because they are born in a high, right? They're born during a time period where...
abundance.
It's abundance. That's right. And prophet generations end up being a dominant culture even as children. And so they're used to being paid attention to. They're used to having influence. They're used to showing up and people giving them some credibility and credence just because they exist. And in part, it's because they're born right after a secular crisis. So they get paid attention to. These are the children that we want to take all of these learnings from the previous saculum, and we want to make sure that they're raised right. And so if you look at baby boomer generation, or specifically that generation, there's a lot of I don't know, like just things that were built for them, right? Things that indicated that they were paying attention to children during that time period. Previous generations, kids, like you threw them a broom and they got to go crawl up a chimney and, sort of rake it out in previous generations. At this point, national parks start to be created or not national parks, but city and town parks are now being fashioned for children to be able to play on them. Disney World and Disneyland, well, Disneyland specifically actually was created during the time period of the baby boomers, and that concept of a Disney dad was created during that time period. There was a lot more children's programming that ended up becoming a big deal because that was, that they were all sort of trying to raise children right. And so the Mickey Mouse Club was a big deal during that time period in the wide world of Disney. And it just became this sort of culture where children were important, they were paid attention to, and even though they weren't coddled necessarily, I wouldn't say that boomers were coddled, they were still given a lot of weight and importance.
Prioritized. Very prioritized.
Exactly.
And so that expectation, it carries with them into their life. Like, I think that my generation should be prioritized. We're important. And they were probably one of the first generations, too, that got a media label, like the baby boomers. I'm sure there were other labels, but in a mass media way, because television came on right around the time that these boomers were starting to be born. I mean, boomers in the television set, like broadcast television, pretty much were born in the same 10 to 20 year span. Like that was the technology that they rose with.
Right.
And so that influenced their culture a lot. And I think a lot of boomer culture was influenced by the television and television broadcasting.
Right. So then boomers end up coming of age, that's when they come of age, is that time period of spring, which is a high. And then they go into young adulthood, right? They're now entering the 20-somethings, teens and 20-somethings during a spiritual awakening. And that's really why they get called prophets, is they become a force to be reckoned with, a cultural force to be reckoned with during a time period of spiritual awakening. And so they're the ones who were on the campuses talking about how, Vietnam wasn't okay. A lot of them were those who supported civil rights movements. There was a huge group of young people who were going to make their presence known and make their voice known during all of these, like, what kind of people do we want to be time periods? And so they end up becoming not just children who are used to being given some credence or credibility or some weight. These are important children. We have to make sure that they're okay. Then they became 20-somethings, teenagers and 20-somethings that were a voice that others were listening to. And so now we look back, there's a lot of statements around how boomers are, narcissists, or they only pay attention to themselves, or they only care about their own thing. But they're used to people paying attention to them. That's part of, it's almost like a rite of passage for them, or not a rite of passage, but more like a birthright. That's actually closer to what I was looking for, is that this idea that for boomers, it's a birthright that people pay attention to them. And prophet generations of every single version and iteration in times past have had the same quality. There's this idea that when they speak, others will pay attention and to some extent organize around them to make it so that their wishes are carried out. And they get followed by a generation that does that for them. And so even when they are now in their midlife, they enter midlife during fall and autumn, which is an unraveling, right? It starts to unravel, but it's also a time period of a lot of abundance. And the sad thing about boomers or prophet generations is that they end up becoming elderly during winter. So the beginning is all good news. Towards the end, now when they're starting to sort of, their influence is starting to close up. That's a time period of scarcity. That's a time period where now we're reevaluating the entire saculum. So this saculum, which in some ways is their saculum, right? They were born at the beginning of it. They experienced the entire thing. And now when we're starting to close up shop on that saculum, there are many things that were just the way reality worked that are no longer rules that they can count on. And so in some ways it starts out really great and it kind of ends in a way that's, like why isn't everybody paying attention still? And to some extent, boomers, I mean, if you notice, even especially in politics, man, they have an almost
overrepresented,
surprising representation for people that are, later on in life in those positions.